Well, today in our gospel, we hear two stories of healing. And in the first, Jesus is asked by Jairus, one of the leaders of the synagogue, to come and heal his little daughter, who is so sick that she is almost dead. And we can hear the pain and desperation in Jairus' voice as he begs Jesus to come and lay hands on her so that she may be made well and live. So Jesus goes with him to Jairus' house, and as he does, he's interrupted by a crowd. And in that crowd, a woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years and who was probably in equal desperation for healing as Jairus and his daughter, comes near to Jesus and touches his cloak. And we hear that immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed. And Jesus says to her, simply and plainly, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And before Jesus leaves the scene, before he even starts on his way to Jairus' house, some people come to him to question Jairus, who was still with Jesus. They think the situation is hopeless. They say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But Jesus tells Jairus not to fear, but to believe. And so he goes with Jairus and a few disciples to the house where the sick girl lay. And amidst people who believe the daughter's situation is beyond redemption and even comical that anyone would try to bring her to life at this point. And Jesus lays hands on her and she rises to health. Now there's so much rich detail in these stories, and we could ponder and discuss them for a longer time than we have this morning, but I'd like to just take a few moments to make a few comments about a few of those details and the concept of healing in general as it's illuminated by these stories. And the first is that we are reminded that sometimes in situations when all seems hopeless, when all seems out of control, that is when Jesus enters the scene. That is when God shows up, as we hear today. And what happens? People are healed. Bleeding stops. Pain ceases. And people are amazed. In the hemorrhaging woman's story, God in Jesus has the power and mercy to stop her hemorrhaging, her bleeding in the unhealthy way in which she was living, simply by showing up in her midst in the crowd. And all she had to do was touch him. His mere presence and touch healed her. And so sometimes in situations that have been perpetuating for years in unhealthy ways, they can be transformed by a simple and maybe even surprising touch of God's love and grace. And when the healed woman returns to Jesus because he asks the crowd who touched him, he doesn't scold her or tell her that she did anything wrong. He just says, "Go. Go and be well and be whole. You have faith, and it has made you well." Essentially, he empowers her. He reminds her of the tools that he gives, the tools of faith, which she can use to help stay healthy and whole into the future. And in the story of Jairus' daughter, we're reminded that through God, people can rise up from weakness and death, even when it seems doubtful or impossible, or when we choose to be pessimistic or ridiculing. God in Jesus still has the power to heal and chooses to heal, no matter what we do or think. And sometimes we just need that simple yet profound reminder. And in the midst of that boisterous crowd around Jairus' house, Jesus brings clarity and peace. He brings what the people and this child need to be whole, even when people don't believe or even when people ridicule him. The crowd's words and laughter don't affect him. He just continues on his mission, and the crowd is amazed. The girl rises and walks, and he says quite practically, "Give her something to eat." So as we consider these stories, we realize that there's a kind of straightforward clarity present. And that clarity is centered on the fact that no matter what happens or what's happening around him, Jesus does not deviate from his mission to heal. He stays on that mission. He's unflappable. He has set out to heal, and so even if there are distractions which threaten to throw him off course, he doesn't stray. He just continues calmly and patiently and lovingly, but with authority and with strength. He doesn't let the crowds derail him. He doesn't let snickering or laughing or doubtful comments set him off. He continues to do what he's set out to do, to make people whole, to restore health. And so he does that responsibly, without straying, and by empowering people to access God's healing and wholeness themselves, too. All of us now or in the past have needed our health restored or to become whole again. We all probably have had a wound that needed healing, a place in our mind or body or spirit that had an injury or that was broken. And one of the interesting things about healing is that healing means restoring health, returning to wholeness. Where there is injury or discord, abuse, neglect, healing, and especially God's healing, restores us. We're brought back to an earlier state when we were not injured, when we were not fragmented, when we were not in pain. Healing restores us to more closely to the image of God in which we were created, closer to the state of wholeness in which we once were, and in which we will find ourselves again one day. And I cannot leave you today without sharing the story of Alexandra Friedman. She's a Hasidic woman who lives in Muncie, New York. She's in an Orthodox Jewish community 30 minutes north of the city, and some of you may have read her story in the New York Times this week. Anybody? Oh, you did? Yeah. In Muncie, many women marry young, and their lives revolve around caring for children and speaking Yiddish and abiding by lifestyle and dress guidelines to adhere to Hasidic traditions. Alexandra and her husband Yosef have 10 children, ranging from 8 months to 21 years. And last month, she became an anomaly in her community by graduating from medical school and obtaining a residency in pediatrics. And her graduation makes her one of the few female Hasidic doctors in the country. And the president of the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association says that it's unusual for residents to have any children, let alone 10. So her journey is one that took extraordinary drive and commitment. And when Dr. Friedman began thinking about medical school a few years ago, she believed that pursuing medicine would augment her spirituality. She says in Judaism, there's a belief that if you don't use the gifts given to you by God, you're not really honoring God. So even while struggling with academic demands, she met the responsibilities expected of an Orthodox mother. She refrained from studying on the holidays and on the Sabbath. She even gave birth to 3 children during the years of her study, and she graduated at the top of her class. And she studied at home with her children around her. They quizzed her with flashcards and adorned her anatomy and surgery textbooks with colored stickers, and they watched her practice her sutures before bedtime. I usually just read books to my kids, but you know. Alexandra secured her rabbi's permission to buy a laptop and get internet service installed so that she could access medical information and study guides that the other students were sharing on social media. And she got a smartphone because there were apps that could teach her surgical procedures. And she obtained her rabbi's approval to drive the family car herself, and her husband would just drive her out of the neighborhood, and then they would switch and she would get in the driver's seat so that they would respect the community around them. She was not always Hasidic. Earlier in her life, she earned a biology degree as an undergraduate, and then she began medical school but dropped out because she developed an interest in Orthodox Judaism. She studied Yiddish and began wearing the clothes that modest dress, and smartphones were off limits. And then she moved to the Hasidic section of Crown Heights to study at a Hasidic seminary, and she met Yosef Friedman. They married, and then they settled in Muncie. And after she had a few children, her mind turned back to that medical education. And as a student, she began assuming a sorely needed role advising Hasidic female acquaintances who had limited information on medical issues, but they had many questions, ranging from menstrual and infertility issues to how gynecological treatment comported with Jewish law and guidelines. She said that people became excited to have a woman who understood the community and who understood medicine. And when Muncie became a COVID hotspot last year, she began telling people to wear masks and getting the vaccine. Her husband believes that this is just meant to be. This is what she's meant to do, he said. But Dr. Friedman's biggest supporter was her rabbi. Last June, he unfortunately died from COVID, but the last thing that he told Alexandra was, "Don't quit." Alexandra stayed focused on her mission and her call despite enormous odds. Despite a community or crowd around her that may not have thought her goal was attainable, she forged on. And she did so to become a doctor, to become one who heals, one who restores health, one who helps others regain wholeness, and who does this despite the odds in her community. And in turn, she found wholeness herself and who she believed God created her to be. Now, while we may not decide to go to medical school tomorrow, I wonder where in this world you find God's healing hand and presence. God can and does show up. God can break into the chaos of our lives. God in Jesus brings wholeness despite the odds, despite doubt, despite hopelessness and distraction. God brings clarity and healing where it is desperately needed. And I invite you to take a moment today and open your eyes to God's healing hand at work in this world. We so often doubt or cannot see it, but maybe if we take a moment to pause, we might discover that God is indeed at work, healing and restoring, bringing wholeness, even in the most unexpected ways. And God remains on that mission despite what the world might do, what you and I might do to try to throw God off course. So where is God's healing showing up in your life? And how can you and I continue God's mission of healing with determination and focus in our life and ministry too? Amen.